A sudden sting exploded against Zyra's skin. Sharp, deliberate. Laughter knifed through the hallway air, cold and merciless. Her books slipped from her grasp, papers scattering like startled birds. No one stepped forward. No one dared. Beneath the burn of humiliation, something ancient and unyielding rose within her. She straightened, locking eyes with her attacker. The game had changed. In the next heartbeat, they would learn why she was never prey. The autumn sun hung low over Brookhaven, pouring pale gold light through the glass facade of the high school. The building seemed to watch the arriving students with the still patience of a monument. Cars rolled up in staggered lines, buses hissed at the curb, and the wide front steps echoed with the sound of hundreds of shoes. Zyra Cole stood at the edge of the parking lot, her hands wrapped around the strap of her backpack. 16 years old, quiet-eyed, her short natural curls catching the light like a halo of dark copper. Her fitted red blouse and navy-pleated skirt were chosen with precision. Neat enough to pass without comment, bright enough to look unremarkable. Beneath the fabric and the calm in her face was the resolve of someone who had trained herself to be noticed only when she chose. She crossed the threshold with measured steps. The scent of floor polish and paper filled the air. Above her, the digital clock glowed a few minutes before the first bell. She had one goal for this year, one ordinary year where no one whispered her family's name, where she could be a student and nothing more. Her father's past as a federal agent, her mother's work as a psychologist, these details stayed locked away. Here she would be simply Zyra. The first hallway spread out like a river delta, branching toward lockers, staircases, and classrooms. Students flowed in currents. In one eddy of movement, Zyra noticed them, the cluster that moved as if the hallway itself belonged to them. At the center walked Grayson Ward, tall, broad-shouldered, his blonde hair perfectly in place. His blue varsity jacket gleamed under the overhead lights, gold trim catching each movement. Around him, Liam, Evan, Dylan, and Connor formed an easy flank. They did not shout. They did not need to. The subtle way other students parted in their paths spoke volumes. Zyra let her gaze pass over them without pause. She turned down a side corridor toward her first class, Advanced History. The room smelled faintly of chalk and coffee. Rows of desks faced a whiteboard lined with maps of early America. The front row was empty. The middle row was nearly full. Zyra chose a seat midway along, neither prominent nor hidden, exactly where she wanted to be. She set her books on the desk, smoothed the edge of her blouse, and began noting the chapter title written on the board. The door swung open. A ripple went through the room, small but unmistakable. Grayson entered, his pace unhurried, scanning the desks as if he were surveying land he owned. His eyes landed on her. The smallest crease appeared between his brows. He stopped beside her desk. For a heartbeat, the room was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. "You are in my seat," he said, his voice calm, almost pleasant. Zyra looked up. Her dark eyes met his. "I did not see any assigned seating chart." From somewhere in the room came a short, uncertain laugh. The teacher glanced over, but did not speak. Grayson rested one hand on the desk, leaning slightly forward. "Middle row, fourth seat from the door. I have sat here since my first year." "Then perhaps it is time for a change," Zyra replied, returning her gaze to the open book in front of her. A hush settled. The clock ticked again. Grayson's jaw tightened, but his smile returned, slow and deliberate. When the bell rang, he straightened, leaning down until only she could hear. His breath carried the faint scent of mint. "We are not done," he murmured, before walking to an empty seat at the back. Zyra kept her eyes on the page, but her pulse marked each word. The hum of the overhead lights filled the silence after Grayson took his seat at the back. The room seemed to exhale, though the tension clung like static to the air. The teacher, Mr. Delaney, cleared his throat and resumed the lecture as if nothing had happened. His chalk moved across the board in slow, deliberate lines, the scrape of it punctuating his words. Zyra kept her gaze on her notebook, copying the date and the title of the lesson, but she could feel the shift in the room. It was in the way students sat straighter when Grayson shifted his weight, the way eyes darted between them like they were watching a match no one had bet on, but everyone wanted to see. Her mind cataloged these details out of habit, the subtle cues of hierarchy, the invisible borders one crossed at a cost. The first 20 minutes passed without incident. Then came the sound, A deliberate scuff of shoes against the tile, louder than necessary. She did not look up at first, but the noise repeated, closer this time. A moment later, Grayson stood at the edge of her desk. He said nothing, only reached past her to take a textbook from the shelf along the wall. His arm brushed her shoulder, light enough to be dismissed, heavy enough to be felt. She turned a page, refusing to acknowledge it. But her pulse had quickened, and she knew he could sense it. That was part of the game, forcing her to notice, to react. When the class paused to copy a diagram from the board, Grayson took the seat directly behind her. There was an empty desk near his friend's, but he chose this one. She heard the faint creak as he leaned back, and then the tapping of his pen in an even, deliberate rhythm. The sound was not loud, yet it burrowed under the surface of her concentration. A hand shot up from across the room. "Mr. Delaney, will this be on the exam?" Evan Blake's voice was smooth, but his eyes flicked toward Grayson and then to her. The exchange was silent but unmistakable. Mr. Delaney hesitated a fraction of a second before answering. "Yes, I suggest you take notes." His tone carried no weight, as if he were merely fulfilling the obligation of speech. Zaira glanced toward the clock above the door. The black hands crept toward the midpoint of the lesson. It was still too early in the day to draw real lines, but she could feel the ground already shifting beneath her. Grayson leaned forward. She felt the air move near her ear. "You learn fast," he murmured, voice pitched so only she could hear, but not fast enough. Her grip on the pen tightened. She did not turn to look at him. "Some lessons are worth taking time to learn," she said evenly, letting the words fall into the air between them. There was the faintest pause, then the sound of his chair scraping back. He rose, circling the room with no apparent purpose until he reached the far corner, where Connor Hayes sat. Grayson placed a hand on Connor's shoulder, leaning in to whisper something. Connor laughed. Not a genuine laugh, but the short, sharp sound of someone acknowledging a cue. The rest of the lesson passed in fragments. She was aware of the dry voice of Mr. Delaney, the scratch of pencils, the turning of pages, but her focus was divided. Every time Grayson moved, she tracked him in the periphery of her vision. He seemed to know it, drifting just close enough for her to register his presence before pulling away again. It was a form of control, a dance of proximity. When the bell finally rang, chairs scraped back in a chorus. Mr. Delaney called out a reminder about the reading for next time, but half the class was already at the door. Zaira gathered her books slowly, not out of hesitation but to avoid the rush. She stepped into the hallway, the noise of 100 conversations crashing around her. The crowd parted slightly as Grayson and his circle emerged from the classroom behind her. She felt their presence before she saw them, the subtle shift in attention from nearby students who turned their heads to watch. Grayson did not speak. He did not need to. Liam flanked him on the left, Evan on the right, Connor and Dylan just behind. As they moved, shoulders brushed hers, not hard enough to knock her off balance, but enough to mark the contact. She kept walking, eyes ahead, but the sensation of their gaze pressed against her back. It was a weight as tangible as the backpack on her shoulders. Halfway down the hall, she passed a row of lockers. The reflective metal caught a brief flash of their faces, amused, curious, assessing. Grayson's expression was unreadable, but his eyes never left her. In that instant, she understood with perfect clarity. She had crossed into contested territory, and there would be no quiet retreat. Whatever game they played here, she had been chosen as the next opponent. She turned the corner toward her next class. The voices behind her dipped for a moment, then rose again, carrying a low ripple of laughter. She did not need to see to know. They were still watching. The third period bell released a tide of students into the main hallway. The air filled with the hum of voices, the clang of locker doors, and the rustle of papers being stuffed into backpacks. Overhead, the fluorescent lights glared against the polished floor, throwing long reflections that moved with every step. Zaira walked with measured pace, her books tucked under one arm, the strap of her backpack gripped loosely in her hand. She kept her eyes forward, but her senses swept the crowd like an unseen radar. Every movement, every glance, registered. She had learned long ago that danger often arrived without warning, wrapped in ordinary moments. Ahead, the hallway narrowed where two streams of students merged. Lockers lined both walls, their metal surfaces catching the light. The smell of floor wax mixed with the faint aroma of cafeteria food drifting from somewhere down the hall. A murmur rolled through the crowd, subtle at first, then sharpening into something more focused. She felt it before she saw it, the way eyes shifted, how conversations thinned into whispers. Grayson emerged from the side corridor, Liam just behind him, the others fanning out like the edges of a net. He moved easily, the faint smile on his face more about possession than humor. Students adjusted their steps to clear his path. No one told them to. The habit was ingrained. Zyra did not change her pace. The space between them closed in heartbeats. When they met in the narrowest part of the hallway, it happened. Grayson's arm swung in a casual, almost lazy arc, his hand connecting sharply with her backside. The sound, a sharp crack, cut through the din of the hallway. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Heads turned. Her body jolted, the impact pushing one foot forward involuntarily. The books in her arm shifted. She tightened her grip before they could fall. Heat rushed to her face, not from embarrassment alone, but from the surge of fury that flooded her chest. She did not speak. Her jaw tightened, lips pressing together. Her eyes, wide for a breath, narrowed in a slow, controlled blink. Every muscle in her shoulders locked, a visible stillness that felt louder than any outcry. Phones were already in the air. A half circle formed as students drew back just enough to give the moment a stage. Some faces showed open shock, brows raised, mouths parted. Others wore smirks, their eyes bright with the thrill of witnessing someone else's humiliation. A few glanced down, uneasy, as though wishing they could step away but too aware of the crowd's pull. Grayson grinned, glancing around at the onlookers. He gave a small shrug, as if the act had been no more than a joke between friends. His friends laughed, short bursts of sound that filled the pause after the slap. Zyra turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze. She did not speak, but in the stillness between them there was a weight. His smile held, but she saw the flicker in his eyes, the awareness that she was not going to react as expected. She inhaled once, deeply, letting the air fill her lungs. Then she stepped forward, parting the ring of onlookers. The crowd shifted to let her pass, some craning their necks to see her face, others lowering their phones in the sudden unease of not knowing what would happen next. Her steps carried her down the hall to the far end, where the noise of the main corridor softened. She pushed open the door to the girls' restroom. The space was cool, the scent of disinfectant sharp. Fluorescent light hummed overhead, reflecting off pale tiles. She chose the stall farthest from the door, locked it, and leaned back against the partition. For a moment she stood still, the echo of the slap replaying in her mind, not just the sound, but the chain of reactions that followed. The smirks, the eyes that looked away, the phones that caught everything. Her hands were steady as she set her books on the closed toilet lid and pulled her phone from her bag. She began listing what she had seen, the number of phones raised, the angles, who had been close enough for clear footage, the faces of those who had looked at her with something other than amusement or shame, potential witnesses. The need for action settled over her like armor. She could feel the edges of it, solid and sure. She would not forget. She would not leave this to fade into rumor. The sharp buzz of her phone broke her focus. A text from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Stay quiet, or else." The words were simple, but they pressed against her chest like cold hands. She read them twice, not because she needed to, but because she wanted the shape of them fixed in her mind. Threats were data, and data was leverage. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the heat of her anger steady into something cooler, more precise. The day was not over. The game had only begun. The corridors of Brookhaven High had their own rhythm, and Zyra learned it quickly. By the second day after the incident, she knew where the morning light fell through the tall windows, which hallways emptied first, and which remained crowded until the next bell. She also knew where Grayson Ward and his circle preferred to move, as predictably as pieces in a well-rehearsed play. From her desk in the library before first period, she watched them arrive through the glass doors. Grayson's pace never hurried, yet he never risked being late. Liam Turner trailed half a step behind him, a silent guard. Evan Blake's smile preceded him, the kind that looked warm from a distance but turned to something sharper when paired with his eyes. Dylan Rhodes often carried folders or envelopes, though never his own schoolwork, as if he were running errands for more than himself. Connor Hayes lingered at the edges, glancing often toward the faculty lounge. It was not just the way they moved, it was who moved for them. Teachers in the hallway greeted them by name, even when their greetings were ignored. The vice principal once stepped aside in mid-conversation to let them pass. Zyra noted every detail. Each interaction was a thread in a net she could already see forming, a net woven from status, from bloodlines, from quiet favors given and taken. In the cafeteria at midday, she chose a seat where she could see the entrance and most of the tables. Grayson's group always arrived together, splitting slightly as they crossed the room, then reconverging at a central table near the windows. That table never had to be claimed. No one dared to sit there before they arrived. Students who approached hesitated at the last moment, diverted their steps, or dropped into another seat with forced laughter. She sipped water, pretending to scroll through notes, while her eyes gathered the smaller moments. Grayson leaning in to speak to Liam, his hand resting on the back of the chair in an unthinking gesture of ownership. Evan tossing a packet of chips across the table to Dylan, who caught it with the ease of habit. Connor checking his phone, showing something to Grayson, the two sharing a glance too brief for anyone else to notice, anyone else except Zyra. That glance told her there was a channel of communication she could not yet see. Messages moved between them, invisible but constant, and they had the assurance of people who knew they would not be overheard. By the third day, her mental map of their patterns was complete enough to trace without notes. They favored certain corridors between classes, took the east stairwell rather than the main one, and always left last after gym, speaking to Coach Rayburn in low tones that stopped when others came near. It was after last period, as she stood by her locker pretending to sort through books, that the signal came. From across the hall, a girl with long dark hair and wire-frame glasses caught her gaze. It was not a stare, more a flicker, a deliberate pause before looking away. In her hands was a stack of textbooks pressed against her chest. She passed close enough for their shoulders to nearly touch. Something small and folded slid into the narrow gap between Zyra's locker door and the metal frame. Then the girl was gone, absorbed into the current of students heading for the exit. Zyra kept her movement unhurried. She closed the locker, waited until the flow of bodies thinned, then retrieved the slip of paper. Meet behind the auditorium. 15 minutes. No name, no signature. The rear of the auditorium was quiet, shielded from the main walkways by a low hedge. The sky had turned a soft gray, and the air carried the first edge of autumn chill. Zyra stood near the side door, her back to the wall, her senses tuned to the approach of footsteps. The girl from the hallway appeared, her books now in a single bag slung over one shoulder. She hesitated a moment before stepping closer. "I am Sierra Lane," she said quietly. "You do not know me, but I know what happened in the hall the other day. Everyone does." Zyra studied her face. Sierra's eyes held both caution and a kind of resolve, the look of someone who had decided that silence was no longer an option. "They have been doing this for years," Sierra continued. "To different people. Some move away, some transfer, most just stop fighting." She glanced over her shoulder before reaching into her bag. From inside, she drew a thick folder, its edges worn, corners softened from being handled too many times. Zyra could see papers inside, printed screenshots, handwritten notes, photographs. "This is everything I have collected," Sierra said. "Names, dates, what they did, who looked the other way. I never thought anyone would use it, but I think you might." The weight of the folder in Sierra's hands was more than paper. It was months, maybe years, of watching without being able to act. Zyra reached out, her fingers closing over the worn cardboard. For a moment, neither spoke. The late afternoon light caught on the metal clasp, and in the silence there was an unspoken agreement. This was no longer just her fight. Somewhere in the distance, the final buses were pulling away. The sound of their engines was a dull roar that faded quickly, leaving only the cool hush of the emptying grounds. Zyra tucked the folder under her arm. The net she had been mapping in her mind suddenly had a different shape. It was no longer just hers to see, it was theirs to tear apart. The folder from Sierra sat on Zyra's desk like an unspoken challenge. She had waited until her mother's car had pulled out of the driveway for the evening shift before opening it. The small desk lamp cast a circle of gold over the papers, leaving the corners of the room in shadow. The first pages were a careful list, dates, names, brief descriptions. Locker vandalized with slurs, October, 2 years ago. Phone stolen and return broken, March last year. Shoved down the east stairwell, minor concussion, victim transferred. Each entry was like a thin cut, but together they formed a wound that had never closed. She spread the photographs out in rows. Faded bruises on forearms, cracked phone screens, lockers defaced with language so ugly she could feel the heat in her chest as she read it. In the margins, Sierra's handwriting was neat, factual, without exaggeration. It made the images heavier, not lighter. One page caught her eye, a printed news clipping about a school board fundraiser, with a photograph of several smiling adults. She recognized Liam Turner's father, the police chief. Next to him was Evan Blake's mother, a district court judge. Dylan Rhodes's father stood near the center, his arm around the superintendent. And beside them, in a dark suit, was Marcus Ward, Grayson's father, CEO of a defense technology company. They were all smiling for the camera, their expressions warm, almost benign. Zaira felt the click in her mind, the way these faces connected to the immunity she had seen in the hallways. This was the shell around Grayson's group, thick enough to make every complaint dissolve before it reached the surface. She began mapping the relationships on a blank sheet of paper, drawing lines between names and titles. Every path seemed to loop back to power: law enforcement, the courts, the school administration, local business, and in the center of it all, the Ward family name. That evening, across town, the Ward family's dining room was silent except for the soft clink of silverware. The long oak table gleamed under the chandelier. Grayson sat at one end, his mother opposite, and his father at the head. Marcus Ward's voice broke the quiet. "I heard there was an incident this week." And Grayson kept his eyes on his plate. "Nothing worth talking about. That is not for you to decide," Marcus said. His tone was not raised, but the authority in it filled the space. "I built a reputation in this town, and you will not tarnish it because you cannot manage yourself." His mother, Evelyn Ward, refilled her glass of water, her gaze fixed somewhere past the far wall. She did not speak. Marcus leaned forward slightly. "If there is a problem, you end it. Cleanly. No noise. No record. Do you understand?" Grayson looked up then, and for a moment something tightened in his expression. Defiance, perhaps, or the flicker of a thought he could not voice. He nodded once. Later, on the school grounds, the sun was lowering, throwing amber light across the football field. Grayson walked with his friends toward the gym, their laughter drifting ahead of them. Near the east fence, a first-year student fumbled with a heavy sports bag, its strap tangled. The boy was small, his frame narrow under an oversized hoodie. Evan murmured something to Grayson, and Dylan smirked. The group slowed, forming a loose circle around the boy. Words were exchanged, too low to catch from a distance, but the tension was visible in the boy's posture. Grayson stepped closer, one hand lifting as if to knock the bag from the boy's grip. For a heartbeat, his eyes fixed on the younger student's face, wide-eyed, caught between fear and confusion. Grayson's hand lowered, his voice dropping to a mutter that made his friends glance at him in surprise. "Let's go," he said. They moved on, the moment dissolving before it could harden into something worse. From behind a row of bleachers, Zaira had seen everything. She had been shadowing them since the final bell, her phone ready in her pocket. She could not yet decide what had made him step back: conscience, strategy, or simply timing, but it was a fracture worth noting. The opportunity came the next day in the cafeteria. The room was loud with midday energy, trays clattering, voices overlapping. Zaira sat at her usual table near the wall, her notebook open as if she were reviewing class notes. Grayson's group occupied their usual spot, the center table by the windows. She let her eyes drift toward them in the way of someone scanning the room without interest. Connor leaned forward, speaking quickly, "And they did not do anything about it. I told you, they cannot touch us." Grayson laughed, the sound low but carrying just far enough. He leaned back in his chair, his voice rising with deliberate confidence. "Nothing touches me in this town." Zaira's thumb pressed the record icon under the table. The tiny red light glowed on her phone screen, a silent witness. His words settled in the air like a seal on everything she had begun to piece together. She kept her expression neutral, her heart steady. This was not just bravado. It was a truth he believed, and perhaps the first crack in the armor he wore. When she stopped the recording, the hum of the cafeteria returned to her ears. She closed her notebook and slid the phone into her pocket, the weight of it different now. The net was tightening, and for the first time, she felt it might be possible to pull. The letter came in a plain white envelope, slipped under Zaira's locker door sometime between second and third period. Her name was printed in block letters across the front. She knew before she opened it that it would not be good news. The principal's office smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee when she arrived. Principal Carver sat behind her desk, hands folded. She did not meet Zyra's eyes at first. "We have received a formal complaint," Carver began, her voice measured, almost rehearsed. "You were recorded in violation of school policy regarding unauthorized audio or video on campus." She paused, letting the words settle. "Effective immediately, you are suspended for 3 school days." Zyra felt her fingers tighten around the strap of her bag. "I was documenting harassment," she said, careful to keep her voice even. "That is not the same as—" "The policy does not distinguish between motives," Carver interrupted, glancing briefly toward the man seated near the window. He wore a gray suit and an expression that did not waver. Zyra recognized him, legal counsel for the school board, and more importantly, a friend of Marcus Ward. The conversation ended not with a conclusion, but with the flat scrape of the suspension notice being slid across the desk. When she stepped back into the hallway, the noise of the passing period felt sharper, every laugh and shout cutting into her. Students moved around her as if she were invisible. By the time she reached the gym, Coach Ramirez was standing alone near the bleachers, his clipboard hanging loosely at his side. He looked up when she approached, his expression troubled. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "I am stepping back. I have been informed there is a transfer opening in another district. If I refuse, I will be reassigned to a less favorable position here." Her throat tightened. "Because of me?" He shook his head, but his eyes betrayed him. "Because of the situation, I am sorry, Zyra." She had seen him steady her classmates through injuries and crises, his voice calm and unwavering. Now he looked like a man trying to keep his balance on shifting ground. That night, the storm spread. Sierra's message came in the form of a single text. "They found me." Zyra called immediately. Sierra's voice was low and urgent. "My parents' address and phone number are online. People are calling, leaving threats. Someone put our home on a map forum with comments about paying a visit." Through the receiver, Zyra could hear muffled voices in the background, her parents, tense and hurried. The sound of a door locking. "They are trying to break us apart," Sierra whispered. Zyra's mind moved through the events like photographs laid in sequence. The folder, the recorded confession, the lines of power connecting Grayson's circle. And now, the cost. She felt the weight of it pressing from every side. Policy used as a weapon, allies pushed to retreat, friends exposed to danger. The following day, she stayed home, the suspension in effect. But the quiet did not bring rest. Every creak in the house sounded like an intrusion. She kept her phone close, screen lighting with messages from Sierra, all clipped updates about the harassment, a suspicious car idling near their street, an envelope with no return address left on their porch. By evening, the sky outside had turned the color of cooling steel. Zyra sat at her desk, the folder from Sierra open again. The faces in the photographs stared back at her, victims who had slipped through the cracks, their stories reduced to whispers in crowded hallways. She thought about the younger student at the fence, the way Grayson's hand had hesitated. Was it hesitation born of guilt or calculation? She reached for her phone, scrolling to the recording she had made in the cafeteria. "Nothing touches me in this town." The words played in her head like a refrain, arrogant and certain. For a long moment, she considered deleting it. The logic was simple. Without evidence, there was no threat. Without a target, there was no retaliation. Her hand hovered over the screen. Then she closed the phone, set it face down on the desk, and pulled her chair closer. She took a pen and began writing names, dates, connections, everything she had learned so far. The lines between them grew thicker, the gaps narrower. She knew this was the point from which she could not return. Suspension, isolation, threats. She understood now that these were not warnings. They were the cost of moving forward. Somewhere deep in her chest, beyond the ache of fear, was a quieter truth. If she stopped, she would be complicit. If she stopped, their immunity would remain intact. She picked up her phone again, but not to delete the recording. Instead, she sent a single message to Sierra: "We continue." Outside, the wind rose, carrying with it the faint rattle of bare branches against the window. In the shifting dark, Zyra felt the line she had crossed, as if a door had closed behind her. Ahead was only the work and the risk and the knowledge that she had chosen this path with open eyes. The game had changed, and now there was no turning back. The rain had stopped just before dusk, leaving the streets slick and glistening under the amber wash of the street lamps. Pools of water reflected the fractured shapes of traffic lights, their colors rippling when the wind stirred. Zyra sat in the corner booth of a quiet coffee shop on the far edge of town, a place where the regular crowd did not know her name. Her fingers were wrapped tightly around a paper cup of cooling coffee, though she had barely taken a sip. The faint hum of conversation from other tables felt distant, like the sound was happening behind thick glass. Across from her sat Mason Layton, a young attorney with a clear, unwavering gaze. He could not have been more than a few years older than some of the recent college graduates who passed through the district each spring. His navy suit was pressed and deliberate, but his posture leaned toward her, a quiet signal that he was here to meet her halfway. The warm lamplight above caught the edges of his dark hair, and the steam from his own untouched coffee drifted between them. "You have evidence," he began, glancing briefly at the manila folder she had set on the table. "But if you want it to hold up, whether it is for a Title IX investigation, a legal complaint, or anything else, they will tear it apart if you do not follow procedure." Zyra sat very still, her eyes locked on him. She had come here hoping for guidance, but now her chest felt tight, as if she were being told she had been running full speed in the wrong direction. Mason spoke slowly, deliberately. "You cannot post identifiable images of victims without their consent. That means faces blurred, names obscured, any detail that could be used to target them, gone. Even if they give verbal consent, get it in writing. Protect them and protect yourself." He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a lined notepad, and turned it so it faced her. With a pen, he drew 3 small boxes in a row and labeled them: collection, preservation, access. "This," he said, tapping the first box, "is your chain of custody. Every file, every clip, log the date, the exact time, and the circumstances under which you obtained it. In the second box, preservation, you keep the originals untouched, not renamed, not altered. Store them in a secure location. In the third box, access, you make working copies if you must edit, but never edit the originals. If anyone questions authenticity, you need to prove they have not been tampered with from the moment they came into your possession." The pen clicked softly in his hand as he underlined the last point. "They will look for any reason to discredit what you have. Even the smallest procedural flaw can give them that reason. You are going up against people with decades of influence and resources. Your only defense is that your work is beyond question." Zyra felt the words sink into her like stones dropped into deep water. She thought of the hours she had spent piecing together clips, the urgency that had driven her, the shortcuts she had taken without thinking. She realized, with a quiet dread, how easily that urgency could be turned against her. Mason closed the notepad, his expression softening slightly. "I am not telling you this to frighten you. I am telling you because you still have time to tighten the gaps. Do it now, before they find them." When they stepped out into the night, the air smelled of wet asphalt and the faint sweetness of coffee grounds from the shop's trash bins. Mason gave her a small, steady nod before disappearing into the dark gap between 2 buildings. Zyra walked home in silence. Each step felt heavier than the last, her mind replaying his instructions like a looped recording: blur faces, secure originals, document everything. By the time she reached her front door, she felt the invisible weight of a new responsibility pressing against her ribs. Inside, the house was quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of the kitchen clock. Sierra sat cross-legged at the dining table, her laptop open and casting a pale glow across her face. Tabs for school schedules and cached video files filled the screen, flicking between them as she worked. Zyra hung her jacket on the chair, then moved to the stove. She filled a small pot with water and set it to boil. The metallic rattle of the kettle lid was loud in the stillness. She tore open a packet of instant noodles, watching as the brittle coils slid into the steaming water and softened. The smell rose in slow waves, filling the kitchen with something warm and familiar. "Hungry?" she asked without looking up. Sierra glanced over, the faintest smile breaking the line of her mouth. "Always." They split the noodles into 2 bowls, setting them among scattered papers and pens on the table. Zyra pushed her laptop aside, and they ate with the quiet ease of people who did not need to fill the air with words. Halfway through the meal, Sierra pulled out her phone and untangled a pair of earbuds. She offered one to Zyra without a word. A low, steady piano melody flowed into their ears, The kind of music that smoothed the sharp edges of thought without erasing them entirely. The steam from their bowls mingled with the notes, and for a few minutes the heaviness of the past days folded into something smaller, simpler. When the song faded, Zaira set her chopsticks down. "We do this right," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of an unspoken promise. "No mistakes." Sierra's gaze was steady, her reply firm. "Then we start tonight." The hours that followed were a blur of careful movement. Zaira laid out her external drives, labeling each in neat handwriting. She scanned through video clips, noting the date and place of each one, creating a ledger as Mason had advised. Sierra handled the photo files, masking faces, removing names from locker signs and class lists. The only sounds were the soft clicks of keyboards and the occasional shuffle of paper. By the time the clock read somewhere close to midnight, Zaira leaned back in her chair, stretching the tension from her neck. She turned to her own laptop to upload a newly organized batch of files to the encrypted storage account they had relied on since the beginning. She typed her password carefully, then waited. Access denied. She stared at the message, thinking she must have mistyped. She tried again, slower this time. Access denied. Her fingers moved to the backup code, one she had never used before. The same red message bloomed across the screen, its sharp color like a warning flare. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from Sierra. "Check the pep rally schedule." Confused, Zaira navigated to the school's internal portal. The familiar calendar, once open to student council members, now displayed a locked document with restricted viewing. The date for the pep rally, previously marked in light blue, was now overlaid with a bold, unmissable banner. Finalized. Access limited to authorized staff only. 2 locks. 2 doors closed without warning. She sat back slowly, her pulse quickening. This was not simple interference. This was a deliberate tightening of control, the kind that left no room for casual mistakes. Someone had anticipated their moves and was sealing the paths ahead before they could take them. The air in the room felt heavier. Zaira's eyes stayed on the glowing calendar, but in her mind she could feel them. Grayson's circle, closing ranks somewhere out of sight. The rally date was set in stone now, and every file they had just organized was trapped behind an inaccessible gate. Her stomach clenched, not from fear alone, but from the sharp recognition that this was the cost Mason had warned her about. The field was theirs, and they were shifting the lines beneath her feet. Somewhere beyond the locked screens and the narrow light of the kitchen, the rest of the town carried on, unaware that a storm was building in the shadows. And the rally was coming. The hum of the desk fan filled the room, its slow oscillation sweeping a thin current of warm air from one wall to the other. Zaira sat hunched over the small table, the pale blue glow of her laptop casting sharp shadows along her cheekbones. The USB drive lay between her and Sierra like an object of worship or doom, its plastic casing nicked at the edges from years of being pulled in and out of ports. She pushed it into the side of her laptop with deliberate care, waiting for the familiar ping of recognition. It did not come. The cursor on the screen spun in place, a tiny mocking wheel that refused to settle. "Try it again," Sierra whispered. Zaira eased the drive out, examined it in the dim light, then slid it back in. This time, the system froze for a breath before flashing a message. Unreadable device. Format to proceed? Her stomach turned cold. "No, no, no," the words escaped before she could contain them. She pulled it out once more, tried the backup laptop. The same message blinked at her. Sierra reached over, her hand brushing against Zaira's. "We still have the cloud." "The cloud account is locked," Zaira cut in, the sharpness in her voice surprising even herself. This was it. This had everything, timestamps, raw footage, originals. The weight of the silence pressed down on both of them. Outside, the distant sound of a train whistle drifted in, the kind that made the night feel wider, emptier. By morning, the news of their faltering position had begun to seep through their small network of allies. The group chat that once pulsed with quick replies now lay quiet. Hours between messages. One by one, excuses trickled in. Someone's parents did not want them caught up in trouble. Another's college applications were too close to risk disciplinary records. Even those who stayed began to couch their messages in caution, as if proximity alone could draw fire. Zaira could not blame them. Not entirely. The circle of protection around Grayson's group was invisible but suffocating, And now, without the evidence, it felt like an iron gate they could not climb. Coach Ellison kept his distance more openly than before. When she passed him in the hallway, he offered a brief nod but nothing more. His eyes slid away before hers could settle on them, and Zaira saw in his posture the quiet calculation of a man who had weighed the risk and chosen his safety. It was late afternoon when she retreated to the library, needing space from the humming anxiety of the day. The building smelled faintly of paper and lemon-scented cleaner, and the light through the tall windows pooled golden across the carpet. Miss Patel, the librarian, was kneeling by a lower shelf, sliding returned books into place. She glanced up, her face breaking into a gentle smile. "You look like you are carrying the weight of the stacks on your shoulders," she said softly. Zaira hesitated, then sank into one of the chairs at a reading table. "We lost most of it," she admitted. "The proof. And now?" She trailed off, the words thinning to nothing. Miss Patel rose, dusting her hands on her skirt, and came to sit across from her. "Sometimes," she said, her voice low, "the way through is not head-on. You know the school's safety and awareness program?" Zaira frowned. "The posters in the hallway? And the monthly broadcasts," Miss Patel added. "Each month, the AV system runs a segment on safety, anti-bullying, fire drills, online conduct. Student-produced content is encouraged, if approved. And once approved, the AV system is yours to use for that segment. No interference." The thought flickered in Zaira's mind. Small and almost fragile. "So, if I submitted something, as long as it is framed as school safety, Miss?" Patel said, her eyes steady. "You have the right to use their equipment, their projection, their reach. It is not a loophole, Zaira. It is a door they built themselves." The room seemed to shift around her. The loss of the USB still weighed heavy. But this was something legal, protected, and embedded in the very rules they could not easily break. "You would need to submit the proposal before the monthly deadline," Miss Patel added, glancing toward the clock above the circulation desk. "Which happens to be," she leaned forward slightly, "today." Zaira's breath caught. "When?" "In 30 minutes. For a heartbeat, Zaira did not move. Her mind raced, what she could frame, what clips she still had access to, how she could tell the truth without breaking the rules Mason had drilled into her. The world outside the library felt far away. Here, the only sound was the soft click of the wall clock's second hand. Then she stood, the chair legs scraping against the carpet. "I will need a computer," she said. Miss Patel's smile was brief, but certain. "Use mine." They moved quickly. Zaira sifted through the fragments she still had. Images blurred where needed, narration she could write on the spot. It was not the sharp blow she had envisioned striking, but it was a blade she could still wield. Every keystroke felt like it carried both risk and promise. In the quiet, Miss Patel brought over a mug of tea, setting it beside her without a word. The warmth from the ceramic seeped into Zaira's hands as she typed. The final file compiled, the form filled. Her fingers hovered over the submit button for the briefest moment. She could hear Mason's voice in her mind, "Protect them, protect yourself," and she thought of the faces that had trusted her to do both. She pressed submit. The confirmation message bloomed on the screen, time-stamped just before the cutoff. For the first time that day, Zaira allowed herself to exhale. But somewhere beyond the quiet of the library, she knew this was not the end of the storm. It was the eye. And the walls of wind were already turning back toward her. The gym was already alive when Zaira arrived, its cavernous ceiling swallowing sound and throwing it back in waves. Rows of bleachers sagged under the weight of students, pressed shoulder to shoulder, their chatter a restless tide. School banners in red and gold hung heavy from the rafters, swaying slightly in the draft from the open side doors. The sharp scent of polished wood and gym floor wax mixed with the paper tang of fresh posters. Near the far end, a temporary platform had been raised for the speakers and performers. A semicircle of local reporters clustered just beyond the marked line, their tripods already set, camera lenses trained on the stage. The air crackled with the electric charge of a crowd about to witness something, not all of them knowing what. Zaira kept her head down as she moved along the edge of the court, the lanyard for her AV access passed warm against her collarbone. She had dressed simply, a fitted black V-neck shirt tucked into a pleated skirt that brushed just above her knees. Her hair was pulled back neatly, revealing the steady lines of her face. If her pulse raced, she would not let it show. Coach Ramirez was already waiting at the AV table, which had been set up behind a barricade of folding chairs. He rose as she approached, his frame broad enough to block the view from curious onlookers. "You made it," he said quietly. His voice held the rasp of someone who had not been sleeping well. "So did you," she replied, searching his eyes for signs of the doubt she had seen weeks ago. It was not there. He leaned closer. "Once I heard what happened with the AV program approval, I knew they could not touch you in here. At least not officially. We run the system, we control the feed. I am with you." The words settled in her like an anchor finding the ocean floor. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. From their position, they could see everything: the podium, the press, the restless sea of students. Sierra was somewhere in the third row of the bleachers, her phone lowered in her lap. She caught Zyra's gaze for a fleeting moment and gave the smallest of nods. The principal stepped up to the microphone, his voice booming from the speakers. "Good afternoon, Ravens. Today we celebrate not only our teams, but the spirit of unity and pride that makes this school great." "Yeah." The students roared in reply, the sound shaking the bleachers. The cheer squad launched into a routine, red and gold pom-poms a blur against the bright court. Drumbeats from the pep band filled the air, their rhythm thudding in Zyra's chest. Her hand rested on the control panel. The pre-approved safety segment was cued, buried between scheduled performances. If they could make it through without interference, the truth, carefully edited to meet the school's own guidelines, would reach everyone at once. Coach Ramirez watched the clock. 5 minutes, he murmured. But in those minutes, she felt the temperature in the room shift. Grayson was here. She could sense him before she saw him, the way one feels the shadow of a passing storm. He emerged from the crowd in the far corner, tall, confident, his Letterman jacket unzipped to reveal a white shirt beneath. His eyes swept the gym until they landed on her. The corner of his mouth curled, not a smile, but a claiming. He strode toward the stage, greeted by claps and a few whistles from his teammates. The principal met him halfway, clapping a hand on his shoulder. Words passed between them that Zyra could not hear over the crowd's noise. But then the principal gestured toward the mic. "Grayson," the principal announced, "our team captain would like to say a few words before we wrap up." Zyra's stomach tightened. This was not on the program. Coach Ramirez shifted his weight, his jaw working. "Stay calm," he said, but his hand hovered over the master volume control. Grayson stepped up to the mic, his voice smooth and carrying. "Thanks, everyone. We have had an incredible season, and I could not be more proud of my team, my school." His eyes cut to Zyra, holding her there. "And the people who keep our traditions alive." The words were dressed as praise, but the tone slid like a blade between the ribs. Zyra kept her face neutral, but inside, every instinct screamed to move, to brace. The cameras turned toward him, red lights blinking. The crowd quieted, sensing a shift. He stepped down from the podium, the mic still in his hand, the cord trailing behind like a tether. Each step brought him closer to the AV barricade, to her. Students craned their necks to follow him. Reporters leaned forward, their hands poised over record buttons. Even the cheerleaders, frozen mid-pose, tracked his movement. Coach Ramirez's voice was low, tense. "Zyra." But she did not move. Her fingers curled around the edge of the table, nails pressing into the wood. She had known this moment would come in some form. Grayson would not let her act without retaliation. What she had not known was how it would feel, the air in the gym thickening with the knowledge that whatever happened next, there would be no turning back. Grayson stopped just in front of the AV table. The mic in his hand caught the faint hiss of feedback. He looked at her, not over her shoulder, not at the equipment, at her. The crowd was silent now, the noise of moments before gone, as if someone had cut a cord. "Mind if I ask you something, Zyra?" he said, his voice carrying easily through the speakers. The sound of her own heartbeat filled her ears. She met his gaze and said nothing. He leaned in slightly, the mic between them, his next words intended for the entire gym. And that was where the moment hung, balanced on the edge, every person in the room holding their breath for what would come next. Grayson held the microphone as if it were a key, and the gym seemed to lean toward him, waiting for the lock to turn. The cheerleaders froze on the sideline, a fan of glittering pom-poms arrested midair. The reporters shifted on their feet, red tally lights blooming like small, unblinking eyes. "Mind if I ask you something, Zyra?" he said, his tone warm enough to pass for courtesy. The overhead speakers carried his voice to the rafters and back again, the words returning with a faint metallic echo that made them feel larger than they were. Zaira did not answer. She stood on the shadowed side of the AV table, the laminated pass cool against her collarbone, her fingers resting on the edge of the switcher. Coach Ramirez was a steady presence at her shoulder, one hand near the master fader, the other at his side as if he were resisting the urge to step between them. Sierra watched from the third row, hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were pale. Grayson leaned closer, the black grill of the microphone catching the light. He lowered his voice. The speakers did not. "You have enjoyed the attention," he said softly. "It would be a shame if it followed you home." The words rolled across the gym, amplified and undeniable. A few students gasped. One teacher straightened where she stood near the bleachers, her mouth opening as if to object and then closing again when the next sentence arrived. "People who make trouble," he continued, "often discover that trouble knows their address." The hush that answered him was a living thing. No one moved. The cheer squad remained a tableau of halted motion. Even the banners above the court seemed to still in the draft. It was the sound of a line being crossed in public, the soft crack that comes before a break. For a heartbeat, Zaira felt the old heat of fury rise, bright and immediate. She wanted to answer in kind, to fling words that would bruise. But the echo of Mason's instructions steadied her. "Procedure is your shield," and Miss Patel's calm reminder slipped into place beside it. "Use the door they built." She exhaled once, slow and complete. "Coach," she said, her voice low and even. "I am with you," he replied. Zaira lifted her hand and pressed the first cue. The gym screens flickered. A school crest appeared, approved, familiar, disarming, and beneath it the title required by the safety program, Student Awareness Segment, Standing Against Harassment and Harm. The tone chime that always preceded official broadcasts rang clearly, 3 notes that belonged to fire drill videos and cyber safety reminders. Students looked up out of habit. Teachers did the same. The reporters' lenses pivoted toward the screen as if they had been trained to follow the sound. Grayson's eyes hardened. He raised the microphone again, but the house system ducked his input under the program feed. His voice thinned to a distant echo, then vanished. The first image filled the screen, a slow pan across empty lockers. The names on the tags were blurred. The camera lingered on a dented door marked with a smear where a slur had been scrubbed away. A calm narrator, Zaira's voice, even and clear, spoke over the image. "In our hallways, harm often happens where many can see it and few will speak. This segment was prepared under the school's safety program to document patterns and provide resources for those who need them." The shot cut to a photograph of a forearm with faint yellowed bruises. The face above the arm was obscured by a soft block. The voice that followed filtered to a neutral register. "I stopped telling anyone because it never changed," the witness said. "It only changed me." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, the kind that did not belong to pep rallies. Zaira keyed the second sequence, her hands steady. A grid of short clips appeared. Books knocked from hands in a passing crush, a shoulder checked in slow motion, a drink spilled with deliberate aim, and an apologetic smile. Each face, except the aggressor's, was blurred. Each timestamp and hallway label glowed in the lower corners. "This footage was recorded in public areas," the narration continued, "with consent from those who appear, and with all identifying details protected as required." A teacher near the baseline nodded almost involuntarily, as if that declaration had been addressed to her alone. The vice principal, standing behind the reporters, folded his arms and stared upward, jaw tight. Then came the witnesses. A girl's hands, twisting together in a pool of light. "He told me everyone would think I was dramatic," the filtered voice said. "I began to believe him because nothing happened when I spoke. A boy, his face completely obscured, a soccer ball resting against his shoe. I changed schools. I decided that was easier than fighting." The gym did not breathe. Zaira did not let the pacing slow. She tapped the overlay that placed the school's Title IX contact and counseling resources along the bottom of the frame. She heard Coach Ramirez draw a careful breath beside her, felt Sierra's gaze like a thread drawn taut from across the room. The final sequence began with a hallway wider than memory. Students moved in a rushing tide. The camera angle was shallow, taken from chest height. The moment arrived as cleanly as a cut. Grayson's arm in a lazy arc, the sharp sound of contact. Zaira's body lurching forward, books catching against her ribs. Time did not freeze. It slowed just enough to insist on attention. Faces turned. Phones rose. A few mouths formed the same small word. The screen held one breath longer than comfort allowed, then shifted to black. When the video returned, it did not show Grayson's face. It showed only a cropped frame of his Letterman sleeve, the blue and gold impossible to mistake. The narration did not accuse. It defined. Inappropriate touching is not a prank. It is harassment. It is a violation. If it happens to you, you are not at fault. Somewhere in the bleachers, a parent stood. A second later, another did, and then three more. The sound that filled the gym was not a cheer. It was the uneven chorus of adults recalling their own years in hallways and recognizing the shape of a wound that had never properly healed. A camera light flared as a reporter pivoted to capture their faces. Zaira dropped the lower third once more, the line of policy references sliding along the bottom of the screen. District Anti-Harassment Policy, Title IX Office, Anonymous Reporting Portal. She had built those into the program with a precision that would have made Mason nod. Grayson moved again. He stepped toward the AV table, the microphone clenched in his hand. The system still suppressed his input, but the fury in his face was visible enough. Liam and Evan had left the team cluster near the stage and were angling through the students toward him, expressions set and careful, as if they were calculating how close they could come without being filmed. The last image in Zaira's segment appeared. Not an accusation, not a face, but a slide with 4 lines in large letters. If it happened to you, you can speak. If you saw it, you can tell the truth. If you are unsure, you can ask for help. If you are afraid, you are not alone. The screen faded to the school crest. The chime sounded again. The house feed returned to live. For a heartbeat, there was only the roar of collective reaction finding its shape, scattered applause that became a wave, shouts of "let her finish," colliding with angry calls of "do something." 2 teachers moved toward the principal, speaking at once. A reporter thrust a microphone toward the stage, calling for comment. Another reporter climbed one step up the bleachers for a higher angle. Cell phones lifted on all sides, small constellations catching the light. Grayson's voice punched through at last, the system's auto-duck easing as the program ended. You think this makes you brave? It was half question, half charge. You think a video will save you? Coach Ramirez stepped forward, placing his body between Grayson and the console without touching him. "Stand down, Grayson," he said, his voice even, pitched for the man, not the crowd. "This is a school safety segment. You do not control it." The principal hurried to the podium, tapping the microphone. "Everyone, please, let us keep order." His voice vanished beneath the swell of noise. Parents had begun to form a loose barricade at the foot of the bleachers, some with arms crossed, some with phones raised, faces set in a way that did not belong to pep rallies or football nights. Grayson laughed once, a sound without humor, and took another step. "You do not know what you have started," he said, softer now, for Zaira alone. It did not matter that the microphone picked up nothing. She heard him. She kept her gaze steady. The tremor in her hands had vanished the moment the program began. In its place was the precise calm that arrives when fear has burned itself out and left a clear field behind. Across the gym, Sierra stood, and with her 3 other students, Zaira recognized from the folder. Not friends, not yet, but witnesses who had chosen a side. A parent called out, asking for the principal to address the video. Another demanded to know what measures would be taken. The reporters were everywhere now, their cameras drinking in the angles of conflict, their producers no doubt whispering in their ears to hold, to keep rolling, to capture the moment a story turns. The cheer squad lowered their pom-poms. The band fell silent with the uncanny discipline of students who understand that noise is now the least powerful thing they can make. Zaira felt the gym tilt toward chaos, not falling yet, but leaning hard enough that everyone had to shift their weight. She glanced once at Coach Ramirez. He gave the smallest nod. On the far side of the court, a door opened to the corridor, and several administrators stepped in, their faces tight, their eyes scanning for the source of the fire after the first smoke alarm. A camera swung to catch them. The red tally light blinked brighter, as if it too held its breath. The sound of voices rose, then braided together into something more insistent. Questions, demands, the rough edge of anger that belongs to people who have finally seen what was always in front of them. And in the center of it, Grayson stood with the microphone still in his hand, closing the distance to the AV table one deliberate step at a time, while every lens in the gym followed. The noise from the gym had not fully settled when the principal's voice came over the loudspeakers, clipped but formal. Effective immediately, a no-contact order is in place between the parties involved in today's incident. All relevant individuals are to remain apart until the ongoing investigation reaches its conclusion. The words echoed down the corridor like the toll of a bell. In the hallway outside the main office, students clustered in tight knots, speaking in lowered voices. The air was thick with a mix of disbelief and speculation, the kind that clings long after a crowd has dispersed. Zaira sat in a small administrative conference room, the pale wood table between her and the assistant principal. Coach Ramirez occupied the chair to her left, his presence both protective and grounding. The walls were thin enough that she could hear the hum of voices beyond, but here the space was compressed, the air close. The assistant principal's tone was procedural. You are not to initiate contact, verbal or physical, with Grayson Ward or any member of his family. This includes electronic communication. Should you see him in a hallway, you will maintain a distance of no less than 20 feet. The same applies in reverse. Zaira nodded once. Her mind replayed the moment in the gym when the last frame of her program had faded to black. She could still feel the heat of the crowd's shifting energy, the weight of dozens of eyes realizing what they had witnessed. She did not regret showing the truth. But now the truth had its own pulse, and it was moving in the world without her control. When they were dismissed, the hall seemed quieter than before. Sierra waited near the lockers, her face drawn but resolute. They will try to bury it, she murmured as they walked together. They always try. Zaira had no reply. Not yet. Later that afternoon, she was summoned again, this time by a soft knock on the door of the media lab. Liam Turner stood there, his usual posture shifted. The confidence in his shoulders had dissolved, replaced by something uncertain. His gaze flickered toward the empty hallway before settling on her. "Can I talk to you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. They stepped into an unused classroom, the blinds half drawn, light falling in thin bars across the desks. Liam leaned against the wall, his arms crossed not in defiance but as if to hold himself together. "I cannot say everything," he began, eyes fixed on the floor. But there were conversations, texts, things the coaches should have addressed. They knew about some of it. He hesitated, jaw tightening. And Grayson? He did not act alone. His father made calls after the first complaint. I heard him. He wanted it to disappear. The words hung in the air, fragile and heavy at once. Zaira studied him. "Why are you telling me this now?" Liam's expression shifted. Guilt, fear, perhaps the start of resolve. "Because it is bigger than him, and it is starting to swallow people who did not even have a choice. I cannot watch it happen again." He exhaled sharply, as if releasing something long held. "That is all I can say. For now." Before she could ask more, the door creaked open and he slipped out, leaving the scent of old floor polish and the echo of his words behind. By the following morning, the undercurrent of tension had risen to the surface. Flyers appeared on certain lockers, anonymous, printed in bold black text, questioning the validity of the video, suggesting it had been edited for drama. The administration removed them quickly, but the message was clear. Grayson's supporters were not retreating. In the front office, a separate storm was gathering. Through the glass window of the conference room, Zaira glimpsed Grayson's parents seated beside a man in a tailored Navy suit. He carried himself with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to controlling a room. The conversation inside was muted, but the cadence of legal language was unmistakable. Documents shifted across the table. Pens tapped. The principal's hands moved in careful, deliberate gestures. By midday, the first ripple reached Zaira. The Ward family had retained legal counsel and was preparing a response. It was not just a question of school policy now. It was the opening move in a larger battle. She found Coach Ramirez in the faculty lounge, leaning against the counter with his arms folded. "They are trying to turn this into a case of defamation," he said quietly. "Their lawyer will argue the footage harmed his reputation without due process. They will push to have it discredited before the investigation ends." Zaira felt the floor tilt slightly under her. The truth was supposed to be solid, but now it seemed like something that could be dismantled with enough precision and resources. Through the window, she saw Liam again, walking alone across the quad. His hands were in his pockets, his head slightly lowered. She wondered how much more he knew, and whether the weight of it would eventually force him to speak in full. As the final bell rang, Zaira gathered her things from the media lab. The air outside had cooled, the late afternoon light stretching shadows across the walkway. She was halfway to the gate when a voice called her name. She turned to see a woman standing near the entrance. Her hair was swept back in a precise knot, and she wore a charcoal gray blazer over a crisp white blouse. A leather portfolio rested against her side. Her eyes were sharp, assessing, but her smile was professional. "Zita Morgan?" "Yes," Zaira replied, her voice cautious. The woman extended a business card. "I am Marianne Cole. I represent the Ward family. They would like to speak with you, privately, before any further proceedings." The card was smooth and heavy in Zaira's hand, the embossed lettering catching the last slant of light. She looked from the card to the woman, then beyond her to the dark shape of a black sedan idling at the curb. Inside, her pulse quickened, not with fear exactly, but with the knowledge that whatever came next would demand more than she had yet given. The woman waited, her expression unreadable. The air between them was taut, holding the promise of a conversation that could change the shape of the fight entirely. "Will you come with me?" Marianne Cole asked. The question lingered in the cooling air, unanswered, as the sound of the car's engine filled the silence. The conference room was warm, though not from the thermostat. The heat came from the voices, low, controlled, but carrying the unmistakable weight of grievance. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in thin slices, cutting across the table where papers, coffee cups, and folded arms formed an uneasy still life. On one side sat the principal, the school board representative, and a note-taker whose pen moved steadily without glancing up. On the other sat parents, some with faces drawn in remorse, others stiff-backed and defiant, as though the very act of being here was an insult. Zaira sat in the far corner with Sierra beside her, not as active participants but as silent observers. Coach Ramirez, hands folded neatly, sat between them and the door. His stillness was not the absence of tension but the steady containment of it. The first parent to speak was a woman whose son had appeared in 2 of the hallway clips. Her voice cracked midway through. "I did not know," she said, glancing toward Zaira. "I am sorry for what happened to you. I cannot undo it, but I can make sure my son understands the harm he caused." She swallowed hard. "We are willing to cooperate." Zaira's hands tightened in her lap. The apology was real. She could feel the sincerity in the tremor of the woman's words. But the next voice, a man with folded arms and a gaze fixed on the principal, was steel and ice. "My son has been painted as a villain in a public spectacle. You allowed a student to broadcast accusations without proper context. This is not justice. It is character assassination." His words were measured, but each one landed like a hammer. "We will not admit to anything until we see evidence that has not been tampered with." The tension pulled taut. The principal leaned forward, his hands clasped. "The investigation is still ongoing. No one is being asked to admit guilt without review. But what happened in that gym cannot be ignored." For the next hour, the air thickened with arguments, some parents pushing for accountability, others circling wagons around their children. The fault lines were visible now, and they ran not just between families, but through the entire fabric of the school's power. By the end of the meeting, a shift had begun. 2 members of Grayson's inner circle, faces Zaira had seen in more than one video, agreed to speak to investigators in exchange for reduced disciplinary action. Their parents' signatures on the consent forms were hesitant, the ink drying like a reluctant surrender. But it was movement. And movement, Zaira thought, was how cracks began. That evening, Zaira and Sierra sat cross-legged on Sierra's bedroom floor, a laptop between them. They had already mapped out the idea, an encrypted online space where students could submit reports anonymously. The name came easily, the listening post. "It has to be more than a venting space," Sierra said, tapping at the keyboard. "If someone reports a pattern, it needs to go straight to people who will act." Zaira nodded. "We will need teachers on the review board, ones we can trust, and maybe an outside counselor." And by the time the night had deepened into the quiet hours, they had built the framework, a secure form, a hidden access page, a plan for how to filter and forward reports without exposing the students who sent them. It was not a perfect shield, but it was a start. The following week, a handful of trusted classmates received the link. By the second day, the first message came in, not about Grayson, but about another incident in a different hallway, one that had never reached the front office. Zaira read it twice, her pulse steady but cold. The wall they were pushing against was larger than she had imagined. On Friday afternoon, Zaira stood at the edge of the school courtyard. The air was bright and sharp, the sun reflecting off the windows in hard, clear light. Students streamed past in every direction, some laughing, some lost in thought, some glancing at her with quick, uncertain expressions. She could feel the hum beneath the surface, the unease, the whispered conversations, the slow rearrangement of alliances. The gym incident had fractured the surface of things, but the structure still stood. Her gaze lifted to the main building, its brick facade solid against the sky. To anyone else, it might have looked unchanged, but Zaira could see it differently now. She could see the hairline fractures spidering through the mortar, faint but spreading. Sierra came to stand beside her. "Do you think it will hold?" she asked quietly. Zaira let the question linger. In the distance, a group of students leaned in close around a phone, their voices hushed. Somewhere else, a teacher watched from a doorway, expression unreadable. "It is holding for now," Zaira said at last. "But it is not what it used to be." The wind caught a loose strand of her hair, and she brushed it back, her eyes still fixed on the building. She knew the fight was far from over. What had happened in the gym was not the end, only the first fissure. A bell rang, scattering the courtyard with movement. Zaira stayed where she was, watching the flow of students as though studying the current of a river. Somewhere behind those walls, old power still operated, confident, resistant, certain it could outlast this moment. But she had seen what a single crack could do. And now, she thought, the first one had been made. She turned toward the entrance, the sound of footsteps and voices rising around her. The day would end, the weekend would come, and on Monday, the wall would still be there. But so would she. In the quiet after the storm, when the echoes of raised voices and hurried footsteps had faded, the school stood as it always had, brick and steel against the changing sky. Yet for those who had seen what happened, it would never look the same again. There are moments in life when the world pretends to return to normal, but if you have lived through them, you know better. The air feels different. The corridors carry a memory. Zaira had not torn the wall down. Not yet. But she had shown everyone that it could be cracked, and in doing so, she had changed the shape of the fight. Change, she had learned, was rarely born in a single act of defiance. It was chipped from the edges, carved slowly by hands willing to keep pressing, even when it felt like nothing was moving. The lesson was not only hers. Every student who had watched the truth spill into the gym now knew that silence is not safety, that fear does not vanish when ignored, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to injustice is to drag it, blinking and gasping, into the light. There is a kind of courage that roars in public, fists raised and voices sharp, but there is another kind, quieter, heavier, the courage to keep standing when the crowd disperses and the cameras are gone. Zaira carried both now. And though she still felt the weight of what lay ahead, she also knew the truth. Cracks do not repair themselves. Left alone, they grow. Perhaps that is the real challenge for all of us. To notice the cracks, to question the walls we walk past every day, to decide whether we will be the ones who help patch them up for the sake of comfort, or the ones who slip the first blade of truth into the mortar and push. If you have ever faced your own wall, whether it was a person, a system, or a silence too heavy to break, then you know what it costs to take that first step, and you know why it matters. I would like to hear from you. Have you ever seen a moment where the smallest act created a crack in something that once felt unshakable? Share your thoughts in the comments. Stories like these remind others they are not alone. And if you believe more people need to hear stories of resilience, justice, and the slow, determined work of change, I invite you to stay connected here. There are more walls to face, more cracks to follow, and more voices that need the courage to speak. Because every wall, no matter how high, begins to fall the moment someone dares to touch it.